This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Support for Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History to the Revolution series comes from the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 157 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. On April 19, 1775, the American Revolution took on a military component. On that day, in the towns of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, British regulars and colonial militiamen exchanged fire. In the aftermath of what became known as the Battles of Lexington and Concord, an American army began to form, so that by July 1775, somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 men had gathered around Boston. Now, over the course of the American Revolutionary War, which took place between 1775 and 1783, it's estimated that about 230,000 men served in the Continental Army, with another 145,000 men serving in state militia units. But who were these men who served? What motivated them to take up arms and join the army? And what was their military experience actually like? These are some of the questions that we're going to explore over the next 2 episodes as we take a closer look at some of the military aspects of the American Revolution. In this episode, we're going to focus on the motivations and experiences of approximately 6,000 to 7,000 men who served in the Continental Army. We're going to explore the motivations and experiences of the Continental Army's African American soldiers. Our guide for this exploration is Judith Van Buskirk, a professor of history at the State University of New York, Cortland, and author of the book Standing in Their Own Light: African American Patriots in the American Revolution. Now, during our investigation, Judy reveals what motivated African American men to join the Revolutionaries' military units, the Continental Army's policy regarding African American soldiers, and details about both the all-black 1st Rhode Island Regiment and John Lawrence's attempts to form an all-black regiment from South Carolina. But first, don't forget that you can extend your exploration of the American Revolution beyond episodes in the Doing History series. With the help of cultural institutions like the American Antiquarian Society and the Smithsonian, the Omohundro Institute has been creating complementary collections of maps, images, artifacts, blog posts, book chapters, and even full-length articles from the William and Mary Quarterly for each episode. You can access the bonus resources for free in the OI Reader app, which is available for all your preferred Android and iOS devices. To download the OI Reader, just visit your favorite app store or visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI Reader. Okay. Ready to muster up and explore life in the Continental Army? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is a professor of history at the State University of New York, Cortland. Her research interests include the American Revolution and African American Revolutionary War veterans and memory. She's the author of 2 books, Generous Enemies, Patriots and Loyalists in Revolutionary New York, and, most recently, Standing in Their Own Light, African American Patriots in the American Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Judith Van Buskirk.
Greetings from Ben Franklin's Philadelphia, Liz Covert.
Judy, thank you so much for joining us. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. And not just because you're in Ben Franklin's Philadelphia and I'm in his birth city of Boston, but as you may know, we're on a quest to discover more about the American Revolution. And today, we're ready to turn to some of its military aspects. So with that in mind, I wonder if you would provide us with an overview of your research concerning the participation of African Americans in the War for Independence.
Well, I guess I would start with numbers. The problem with numbers is that when you put 10 historians in a room and ask them a question about numbers, you get 20 different answers. With respect to the numbers of African Americans who fought on the American side, that the sacred number for years has been 5,000. And this number appears with usually no footnote or source whatever, whether it's in textbooks, or monographs, or articles. So it appears as if carved in stone. The earliest source for the 5,000 number that I've been able to find is a late 19th century book. And there the number sits unadorned with evidence, no methodology at all. But a couple of people have recently taken a shot at estimating the number and have come up with more like 6,000 or 7,000. But of course, there's more to the story than the numbers. What I'm trying to do in this book is to make the African American soldiers walk out of the pages, their distinct personalities and experiences. And most of the sources about Black Revolutionary War that's thus far are from whites who talk about them as a group. So you'll find sources saying, likely Negroes built fortifications or the Negro troops marched very well. But you give a biography about an individual and you tend to remember not only the stories, but the context in which the stories occur. So this book is filled with men and their stories and men whose names you haven't heard before. Prince Bailey, Mark Murray, Hamid Ahmed, Jeff Brace. And what do they tell us about the revolution? Well, their narratives enrich and complicate the story of the revolution. They tell battle stories not in sync with the versions provided by the generals. And they'll tell you what they were up to when they were not on the battlefield. They tell you that they served in an integrated army. And when I tell people that, they say, wait a minute, wasn't it segregated until Truman, passed the executive order in 48? But no, Washington's army was an integrated one. And the Black men served longer hitches than white guys. And after the war, there's a story, because their struggle continues into the early republic. And that early republic is a rough place for Black people. It denigrates Black people. And that happens up north as well. So the African-American vet had to fight to get in to the army. He had to fight to defeat the British during the war, and then he had to fight after the war for, his rightful place in society. And their children and grandchildren in the Black abolition movement, they absorbed the stories and used their example in their arguments.
Well, we certainly need to dive into a lot of different details here. But before we start getting into the details, we should really talk about the historical sources Judy used to research African-American participation in the War for Independence. Because it seems like we know both a lot and very little about African-Americans who served in American military units because of what the historical record tells us about it. Judy, you wrote Standing in Their Own Light with information you gleaned from Revolutionary War pension records. Would you tell us about the various pension acts enacted by Congress and about the purpose the acts were meant to serve and about the benefits they were meant to provide veterans?
After the War of 1812, the economy was percolating in this country and the government had money and there was a cultural shift, which is explained in Jack Resch's book called Suffering Soldiers. And, our president at the time was a Revolutionary War vet. And people were beginning to appreciate more, the contributions from the average guy in the American Revolution. And so Monroe proposed that we give pensions to the old vets from 76. The Pension Act was passed in 1818. And in it, any vet who served in the Continental Line, at least for 9 consecutive months, and could prove financial distress, they would get a pension. And the government estimated there might be 2,000 guys, who would qualify for this. And when the Pension Act was passed, 20,000 guys come streaming into the courthouses to apply for a pension. A couple of years later, in 1820, the Congress passes another act because there are just so many men who are applying and they're not destitute. They're doing fine, thank you very much. So they pass a law that says that even if you've gotten a pension already or you're in the process of getting one, you have to provide an inventory of everything you own with a value attached to it. And so if you pass muster, you got an $8 a month pension check, which was a great thing for poor men, These inventories, they might list, a sum total of $4 or $5 as the sum total of all these guys had to their name. And so $8 a month doesn't sound great to us, but to them it was quite, substantial. And then in 1832, the government decided to broaden the field to militia and the state lines, provided that the vets serve at least 6 months. And they dropped the property requirement. And so many more guys came streaming in. And these pensions are great, because they tell stories from the average guy in the American Revolution. There are problems with them. There are memory problems because the 1818 Act is 40 years after the fact. And the 1832 Act is, 35 years later. And there's the problem of these stories being written down by white court clerks. So they're filtering the story. And the stories are shaped by the questions that the government wants to know. In the legislation, they ask for certain information. So you have to keep all that in mind. But having that in mind, you read the stories that come through and they're phenomenal.
I wonder if you could provide us with an example or two of the pension records you looked at and tell us about the stories you found in these records and how you were able to get at what actually happened based on the veterans' reporting of what had happened.
So there's a vet who was present at the Battle of Freeman's Farm, which is part of the Saratoga campaign. And he doesn't say much in his pension, but he says, I remember after the war, there were lots of Hessian prisoners of war in a meeting house who were shot. This is after the battle. And I thought, wow, I don't know that about the Saratoga campaign, But just because that says something doesn't make it true, right? So I went to the David Library of the American Revolution, and I started looking through histories of Saratoga. First, I looked at the general's reports, from the battle to the Continental Congress, and there was nothing about this in the sources. And then I started looking back, and I didn't find anything in the histories until Richard Ketchum wrote a book about the Saratoga campaign. And he found another primary source, and that was a woman's, it was a letter or a diary, and she was a person who went and nursed these Hessian prisoners of war after they were shot. Now, on the American side, they said something about the prisoners were trying to make an escape or something like that, but they were shot in the meeting house, according to these two sources. So whenever I would find something that was out of line with what I knew, Liz, I had to go back and find other sources to see if there was anything to back these things up. But there are other stories that are just so sweet from the war and afterwards. Like there's this one vet, Jack Gardner. He was a drummer at West Point, and his buddy, who was supporting his pension, visits him. And he says in his support document for this Jack Gardner that Jack was the best drummer at West Point by far, and he learned drumming from Jack Gardner. And so he said the two of them went out on Jack's porch, and they drummed together, what they called the old Continental beats. So there are those kinds of stories that, of course, I can't find another story to support that, but, I believe it happened. And you get that sense of life, of individuals, acting from the pension records.
Now that we know about the records Judy looked at and how she verified the stories those records contain, let's now turn to the actual service African-American soldiers provided the revolutionaries' cause. At the start and throughout the American Revolution, the 13 British North American colonies turned states existed as a slave society. Judy, why did African Americans choose to serve in American military units and fight for a slave society?
Well, all the 13 colonies featured slavery in their respective societies. But it's important to distinguish between slave societies, that is, colonies whose economies depended on slave labor, and other colonies whose economies did not. We call them societies with slaves. It's a distinction that historian Ira Berlin made in his work. But in either case, African American men were not fighting for the status quo. They were banking on the future, and they got positive cues from the revolutionary movement that roared about Britain's attempt at enslaving the colonies. They could see liberty trees and liberty caps and liberty poles. And those words, liberty and equality, filled the air. Now, many of them might have been somewhat skeptical as to whether it was meant for them, but their enlistment was very much a down payment on a better life for them and their children. But Black men often, they shared the same motivation for enlistment as white men. They were poor, and the bounty money could help them and their families. And some of the vets bought family members out of slavery with their bounty money. They were men looking for adventure. They felt that raw excitement of the times, and they wanted to sign up with their buddies, who were signing up. Many of them substituted. They subbed for other men earning money. And some, were just inspired by the words of the revolutionary movement and, about duty to one's country and so on. And some joined for reasons that only Black men could experience. Their masters would free them if the enslaved man subbed for the master or for the member of the family. And for a brief time, Rhode Island freed slaves who enlisted for the duration. But the Black man, he had a lot more to think about as he contemplated enlistment. Would the state governments and masters live up to their word? Would Black soldiers serve as, cannon fodder? They had to figure that out before they enlisted. And they had a real choice when they were considering signing up. And that is that the British offered African-American men who belonged to rebels freedom if they came and worked in the British military effort. And that offer was reinforced by generals throughout the war. And it got to the point where I think it was General Clinton who said, if you come across the lines and you can adopt any employment and be free. So when these vets who fought in the Continental Line and in the militias, they really had a viable choice when they signed up. Mark Murray tells us in his pension that he was splitting rails on a farm in North Carolina when his dad brought him news of the British capture of Charleston, South Carolina, and that was the South's major port. And the old man thought it was proper that his 30-year-old freeborn son join the militia because his country needed him. So Mark signs up for the first of many 3-month stints in the militia. And after each hitch, Mark presented his discharge papers, to his dad. There was a little ritual associated with the end of each stint.
So the British Army offered freedom to slaves who were owned by rebels and somehow made it into their ranks. But what did the Continental Army offer? Would you tell us about the Continental Army's policy concerning African-American soldiers? I mean, did the Continental Army offer freedom as well, or was freedom offered just to men from certain states like Rhode Island?
The Continental Army's policy on African-American soldiers came from the civilian wing of the government, the Continental Congress. And at first, no Blacks were to be recruited. And Washington's orders reflected this. No boys, no deserters, no Negroes. Washington asked the Board of War if he could distinguish between slaves and free Blacks. No, said the Congress, no. Well, there were many free Black men already in Washington's army from back in the Lexington-Concord days, and they let it be known that they were, to use Washington's words, much dissatisfied. So in 1775, Washington approves the recruitment of free Blacks. But then Congress hemmed him in again by stipulating that only Black soldiers who participated in the Army at Cambridge could enlist, no others, reaffirmed the Congress. And Washington then warned John Hancock, the president of the Congress, that soldiers who felt they were left out could seek employment elsewhere, which was a coded phrase for the Brits. They could go to the Brits. An alarmed Congress then allowed free Blacks to enlist in early 76, excluding only boys, old men, and slaves. And, they served in an integrated army. There was one regiment in the Rhode Island line that featured Black privates for only a couple of years with white officers. And there were also all Black companies of men with white officers. But for the most part, the Continental Army was integrated. And the laws associated with enlistment varied from state to state.
Did the Continental Army's policy regarding Black soldiers allow them to rise through the ranks as far as white men, given that it was an integrated army?
No, there was the glass ceiling at the private level pretty much. A couple of my colleagues have pointed out like one individual who might have been an African American and might have been an NCO, a non-commissioned officer. But I've not found evidence of this. They were pretty much at the private level throughout the war.
And what was the overall experience like for African Americans who served in the Continental Army? Did they actually get to soldier and fight in battles? Or did the Army relegate them to manual labor tasks such as building roads and fortifications like redoubts?
Well, Black men both fought in battle and performed support duties like constructing fortifications and serving officers. And while Southern states tried to take guns out of the hands of African Americans, 75% of Black Southerners in my sample noted specific battles in their pension applications. And while being present at a battle doesn't necessarily mean that they saw combat, Evidence of a wound would indicate that veterans were likely in the thick of the action. And more Southerners in my book noted being wounded than soldiers from north of the Mason-Dixon line, which was kind of interesting. And one vet, Liz, really sticks out for me, and that's Thomas Lively of the 8th Virginia. He survived the encampment at Valley Forge. He lost an eye at Monmouth in 1778. He was wounded in the leg at the siege of Charleston. He was a prisoner of war for 14 months, and then he hobbled into Yorktown where he participated in the siege. And, I'd like to nominate Thomas Lively for a posthumous Purple Heart and any other service medal applicable to his situation. And that's Thomas Lively of Petersburg, Virginia. He was penniless when he applied for a pension as an old man. And about, I'd say 20 of the soldiers in my sample mentioned seeing officers killed or wounded. One South Carolina vet recalled the death of General Pulaski, the famous Polish soldier, in Savannah. And the vet said, the general's thigh was cut off and then he died. A Rhode Island soldier saw Lafayette wounded at Brandywine. Another vet saw his beloved general, whom I never heard before I read the pension, William Lee Davidson. He was shot on his horse. And the black private recorded the general's last words, which was something like, "Help me down, boys. I'm a dead man. Spread the word," Another vet in his pension application wanted to make sure that his dead buddies would be remembered, so he purposely mentioned these privates' names in his pension. There were black soldiers in light infantry units, which were the elite of the Army. There were many black soldiers who received badges of merit when discharged, an honor that many white vets didn't receive. So yes, they fought in battle, but as black men, they were prone to support duties, most notably as servants to officers. Now, most men who served as such did not point to their skin color as the reason. You have to remember that black men who applied for a pension had to be very careful. They likely played down any racist treatment because they realized their applications would have to be approved by their local courts and then the Washington, D.C. Pension Office. And all these places were peopled by white men. But some of the vets very matter-of-factly say words to the effect that, well, being a colored man, I was assigned to be a waiter to an officer. Or others might say, the only way I could get into the Army was to substitute for another man. I just couldn't, sign up on my own. And many African Americans served as wagoners, which was an essential non-combat role in provisioning the Army. And there were civilians hired to drive wagons, but there were also soldiers who did so. And wagons, I learned in my research, constituted a perennial headache to George Washington. There weren't enough of them. And I remember one order from Washington where he chided officers who put too many of their niceties on the wagons. And Washington said, if I see one more officer's heavy bedstead on a Continental vehicle, that officer's going to be severely reprimanded. Years ago, John Shai, the great military historian, wrote a piece about the unheralded importance of wagons, and black men were very much a part of that scene.
Judy, you just provided us with some really descriptive stories of the African-American men who served. Men like Thomas Lively and the Wagoners, and I just wonder, are these detailed stories mostly what you read in the pension applications you examined, or are these stories really exceptions to the rule? And while we're at it, I also wonder whether you saw any distinct differences between the pension applications of white soldiers and black soldiers.
Most of the pensions are very terse documents. When I first started this project, I thought, I'm going to get all these great stories, from the vets. And, whether it's because the vets themselves provided only what the government wanted to know, or whether the white court clerks kind of wrote as little as possible, there's not a lot about what they experienced on the battlefield. I looked at almost as many white pensions as I did black pensions. And at one point, I thought that maybe the Southerners were using the passive voice. I was marched, or I was made to do something. But then as time went on, I thought, no, the white pensioners are doing that as well. The white pensioners, they're more prone to include George Washington in their pensions. Oh, yeah, I saw George Washington when blah, blah, blah. And the black pensioners are much less likely to do that in their pensions. They mention Washington, a couple of the guys who were in the line early on, say at the crossing of the Delaware and the Trenton action. Washington asks soldiers whose hitches are up at the end of the year, in a week's time, they're up, to stay. And some of the black men record having an actual conversation with Washington himself. So no, there's not a whole lot of a difference that I saw between white and black pensioners.
Now, earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Would you tell us about this regiment and how it came to be?
Well, by the end of 1777, things were looking pretty bad for the Americans, and they were shellacked at Brandywine. They couldn't dislodge the Brits from the Philadelphia suburbs at Germantown. And so while the British settled in the American colony's largest city, Philadelphia, for the winter, and they had a pretty comfy time of it, Washington and his men, shivered through the winter at Valley Forge with understaffed regiments, including substantially reduced numbers within the regiments. And that was the case for Rhode Island. They had 2 regiments with very few men in them. So a contingent of Rhode Island officers, thinking outside the box, led by General Varnum, they approached George Washington with a novel idea. Let's set up a regiment composed of slaves who would become free men upon enlistment, provided that they served for the duration of the war. And African-American freemen had been serving in the Rhode Island line since the beginning of the conflict. And most recently, in October of 77, Rhode Island soldiers, including many blacks, under Colonel Christopher Greene, had trounced an elite Hessian unit at the Battle of Red Bank in New Jersey. So the Rhode Island officers knew that black men made good soldiers. So they convinced Washington. Washington gave, tepid approval to the idea, enough to induce the Rhode Island Assembly to pass a slave enlistment law in early 1778. So every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian would enlist for the duration of the war, receiving the same bounties and wages as whites. And once approved by Colonel Greene, the new recruits would be free. Meanwhile, the masters, they would be reimbursed, the funds for which would come from Congress. So this was an all-black regiment with respect to privates with white officers, and it is totally unique in the Continental Army. A couple of other states considered such a measure, but they didn't follow through with it. But there was a very narrow window for black men to enlist in the 1st Rhode Island because very unhappy slaveholders found themselves at a loss for the enslaved men who enlisted, and soon learned that the Continental Congress was broke. So 3 months after they passed the slave enlistment law, they repealed it, giving men of color only until June the 10th, 1778 to join Greene's regiment. And we know far more about white officers like Colonel Greene than the rank and file of the regiment. Like the first black man who signed up was a guy by the name of Cato W. Greene. And we only know about him that he was a servant, he was a slave to the man who was about to become the governor of Rhode Island. And that's about it. Cato enlisted on February the 15th, 1778. He made a mark on the enlistment papers rather than a signature. He remained a soldier until he died in July of 1780. But there was a range of ages in the 1st Rhode Island. There were 16-year-olds as well as a 53-year-old gray-haired man who was a shipwright. He was a mulatto. His name was Pharaoh Hazard. He was also in the regiment. So the new regiment goes off to East Greenwich to train, but they're called into action very quickly when the Americans decided to try to flush out the British from Newport, Rhode Island, which was Rhode Island's major port. So with only a few months' training, the 1st Rhode Island was an important part of the body of men who held the American side's right flank. They were up there in the front. The 2nd Rhode Island, the White Regiment, had just sustained significant casualties at another battle, and so they stood at the 2nd tier of units that day. So the Black Rhode Island's first trial was at a major battle. And you got to imagine what that must have been like for farm boys, to sustain the shocks of such a scene. If your listeners haven't been to a Revolutionary War enactment, I'd recommend that they go. I attended a Battle of Germantown event a couple of years back, and I was astounded at the ear-piercing racket a line of just 12 muskets could make. And you multiply that by 100-fold with cannon blaring as well. And that right flank, those rookies, they withstood more than one Hessian assault and shells lobbed in from the ships in the Narragansett Bay. And although the American Army retreated, no enemy pierced the right flank. They did their job. Nevertheless, after the battle, a rumor spread around camp that the 1st Rhode Island's conduct was subpar. And then Washington countered this rumor, saying in a message to the troops that the 1st Rhode Island was well entitled, to all the proper share of honor of the day. Then when the Brits pulled out of Newport, Rhode Island asked that a regiment be left behind, and George Washington determined that the 1st Rhode Island would do this duty. I can find no reasoning for this decision in the sources, My guess is that Washington felt that a black regiment might stir discord in the main army, maybe. The main army was encamped on the Hudson River. At any rate, George Washington, the son of Virginia, gave the men of color a support job in making fascines. Virginia passed a law that said free mulattoes could serve provided they didn't carry a gun, provided that they built fortifications and that kind of thing. And Washington gave them this kind of job, and they made fascines for well nigh 3 years up there in Rhode Island. But when the French army arrives in Newport, the 1st Rhode Island are ordered back to the American army on the Hudson at the same time that the army is reorganizing. So as of January 81, Rhode Island goes back to having one regiment. That is white and black men together with the remaining black men in 2 all-black companies within the newly named Rhode Island Regiment. So the 1st Rhode Island and the 2nd Rhode Island become the Rhode Island Regiment. And it's integrated, but the companies are segregated. And in May of 1781, disaster strikes. A unit of Loyalist fighters completely surprise elements of the Rhode Island Regiment, killing several men, including Colonel Greene. But the survivors, they regroup and they march with George Washington's army and the French army down to Yorktown, what proved to be the last battle of the war. And it's at this time that foreign officers compliment the discipline and the appearance and the general competency of the black soldiers. So the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was in a position to answer the critiques about black men's abilities as soldiers because they were a discernible black unit in Washington's army.
It sounds like the 1st Rhode Island's uniqueness as an all-black fighting unit was sometimes problematic in that they did occasionally experience discrimination because they weren't a fully integrated unit.
Yeah, that's true. But what I think is that they might have liked the fact that they were in a segregated unit. They were fighting with other black men. They were intense and their messes were all black men, and they could tell jokes. They could understand one another. They didn't have to interact all day with white guys. There might have been, a positive part of that for them.
Now, Rhode Island was successful in forming a black regiment, but if we've seen or heard the music from Hamilton the Musical, we know that it wasn't the only state that tried to form such a regiment. We know that John Laurens of South Carolina also tried to form a similar all-black fighting unit, but that he wasn't successful with it. Judy, let's talk about our sponsor for a moment, and then I hope you'll tell us about John Laurens and his attempts to form an all-black regiment from South Carolina. This episode is made possible by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943. In partnership with the Journal of the Early Republic, the William and Mary Quarterly is publishing a special issue dedicated to investigating the American Revolution. Now, why did not 1 but 2 early American history journals decide to reinvestigate the history of the American Revolution? Well, as we've been exploring, the American Revolution wasn't just one event, but a series of many events. Not just one response to a one-sided issue, but a many-faceted response to a many-sided issue, and there's still much more to discover. Now, you may be asking yourself, just how much more is there to discover about an event that took place nearly 250 years ago? This is one of the questions Michael McDonnell and David Waldstreicher have set out to answer in their William and Mary Quarterly article, Revolution in the Quarterly? For many years, historians tended to cluster together and search not for several explanations of the Revolution, but for just one good explanation of the event. And since 1943, the William and Mary Quarterly has been a part of trying to provide that one good explanation. In fact, although how we view history changes over time, McDonnell and Waldstreicher have been able to trace how the William and Mary Quarterly has explained the history of the Revolution with just one truth at the core of all its articles about the Revolution. Now, what is this one truth? And how might the authors in the William and Mary Quarterly expand their definitions of and the questions they raise about the Revolution? Find out by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/WMQ promo, where you can order a copy of this special American Revolution-themed William and Mary Quarterly for a listeners-only discounted rate of just $10. So Judy, we're curious about John Laurens and his attempts to form a black regiment from South Carolina. Would you tell us about Laurens, his attempts, and why he was ultimately unsuccessful in forming an all-black fighting unit like Rhode Island did?
John Laurens was the son of one of the most richest planters and biggest slaveholders in the South, and that is Henry Laurens, his father. And he grew up in a slave society whose population was about 60% black, with a concentration of those enslaved people on the coast, which is where John was brought up. And his father had amassed a fortune in a slave trading company when he got out of it in the early 1760s, privately expressing his opposition to slavery. Still, Henry Lawrence owned 7 or 8 plantations in South Carolina and Georgia with hundreds of slaves. So John grows up at the major plantation with a father who makes noises about freeing his slaves sometime in the future. It was always in the future. And then at age 17, John, his father, a couple of his brothers, and a young slave, they traveled to Europe in 1771. And there, John attends school, first in London, and then he transfers to Geneva, where he devours Enlightenment thinkers, who oppose slavery. He returns from Europe, immediately signs up as a soldier, and joins George Washington's staff, where he befriends other supporters of abolition, Alexander Hamilton, the Marquis de Lafayette. And indeed, it was John Lawrence who wrote the letter from George Washington to the governor of Rhode Island concerning the formation of a black regiment there. John loses no time in writing to his father about forming a black regiment in South Carolina, using his share of the slaves that he would have inherited as a nucleus for this regiment. And John thought, a stint in the military would be a great step between slavery and liberty, he tells his father. And the slaves, they're used to taking orders, so they'd be great soldiers. And John Lawrence has every expectation that his father is going to agree, because the father has been telling him forever that slavery is a bad thing and he wants to liberate his slaves. But the father, on receiving this letter, is alarmed. He says, whoa, not so fast. I need to see some mature deliberation here, young John. You run the risk of being ridiculed. Have you talked to George Washington about this? You're a Don Quixote, because not one other person has brought this idea up to me. And the slaves, they wouldn't cotton to this idea either. Why would they leave, the comfort of the plantation and their families to go off to war? So Henry suggests to John that he free the slaves first and then try to recruit them. He says, I guarantee you nobody's going to take you up on your offer. And John shoots back about being prepared. He's thought this through. He's prepared to battle what he calls the monster public prejudice in South Carolina against this idea. He's prepared to transform what he calls irrational beings into disciplined soldiers. He's even thought of the uniform they would wear. It would be a light color to contrast with their black skin and so on. And the father replies by implying that John's motivation for this idea might be because he wants to advance in rank. A colonel heads a regiment. So the father says to the son, why not come down to South Carolina and create a regiment of white guys? And John bridles at this imputation. After a series of letters, though, John gets the idea that his dad is not happy about this. He says, no, I get it. You're against this. This is probably an eccentric scheme. It probably never work, and I'll drop the idea. Meanwhile, the Brits decide to launch a southern campaign. They take Savannah and are poised on the South Carolina line for several months. And the Continental Congress recommended that South Carolina enlist about 3,000 blacks under white officers, but they left it to South Carolina and Georgia to decide whether they wanted to do this or not. And, Southern politicians thought that this idea was dangerous. The South Carolinians seemed more afraid of slave insurrection than of the British, and the slaves were rumbling at this point. Henry Lawrence, who's the president of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, is hearing stories about slave problems. A slave on his plantation threw an overseer on the ground and threatened to kill him. Pro-British blacks were raiding Lawrence plantations. Slaves from the country plantations were just showing up at Lawrence's city home, unbidden, and then they just laze around, says the letter writer. Eventually, Henry Lawrence leaves the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to return to South Carolina, where he's in the House of Representatives. And he comes to support the idea of raising black regiments. The British have conquered Georgia and Savannah, and they are poised, to descend upon South Carolina. And so does General Benjamin Lincoln. He's the leader of the Continental Army in South Carolina. He wants to see blacks serving. And eventually, Nathaniel Greene, who becomes the top general down south, he recommends to the South Carolina legislature that they form black regiments. But the South Carolina legislators, they spurn this idea. There's just no way they're going to put guns in the hands of slaves. And the end of the story, John keeps on. He tries to get the governor of Georgia to cotton to the idea to no avail. And eventually, young John loses his life in 1782 when he kind of irresponsibly leads a raid on the British, which results in his death and the death of 3 others in his unit. And the 2 enslaved men John left behind in camp were, according to the sources, particularly ill-clad to the point of being almost naked. And there was a black veteran, actually, in the pension records who was there at this last action of John Lawrence's. And he, in his pension application 36 years later, he mentions it. And the man's name is Andrew Pebbles. And when Andrew Pebbles applies for a pension, his wife and his children are still enslaved in 1818. So on the one hand, Pebbles personifies John Lawrence's aspirations because he served as a soldier. On the other hand, Pebbles' family situation reflected Henry Lawrence's failure to make his private convictions a reality in his lifetime. So Henry Lawrence dies a heartbroken old man on Nepkin Plantation, where according to the 1790 census, there are still 300 slaves, on this plantation. So I don't know that South Carolina was ever really going to field a regiment, but John Lawrence did his level best to try and make it a reality.
So what happened to the African-American veterans after the war? You mentioned that the early republic was a really tough place for them, but what was it really like for them to go home? And did the fact that they had served in the military to effect independence give them any sort of extra foothold or advantage in the new nation?
Yeah, that's a good question, because after the war, it's a mixed bag for African Americans. There is the gradual demolition of slavery up north. There are famous cases in Massachusetts during the war of slaves who say, wait a minute, the state constitution says everybody's free and equal, so shouldn't we be? And juries agreed with them. And so that starts the beginning of kind of a judicial dismantlement of the institution in Massachusetts. And then in 1780, Pennsylvania passes the Gradual Emancipation Act. That's the first, legislative act that does this, and other states in the North follow. And then in the Chesapeake, there's talk about looser manumission laws. So as the vets walk home, I think they see hope on the horizon. They have a discharge certificate that says their name, comma, soldier. That's what it says. It's a printed form, and there's a space for the name. And it doesn't say black soldier or man of color. It just says soldier. And they often went home with badges of merit. So at the bottom of a discharge certificate, if their service merited it, they got a badge of merit. And not all whites get them. So it's the one thing, that black men could get that white men might not get, this recognition. And when they walk home, the families talk about seeing them in uniform and how proud they are of these guys. There are individual cases in the pension records of black vets getting a break because they served. In the South, though, you had the growth of the Cotton Kingdom, and you had the mass removal of thousands of slaves from the Chesapeake to the lower South, and Virginians saw the number of free blacks grow by more than a third from 1790 to 1800. So they passed laws that could re-enslave blacks, and they passed laws that limited the number of free blacks in Virginia. They even went after free black orphans. They said you can't teach them to read or write. In the North, slavery was on the brink of Niagara, but the Northerners weren't prepared to give African Americans equal rights. Northern states started to deny free blacks the right to vote. New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and some southern states, too, where blacks could vote. Maryland and North Carolina, they were also denied the vote. In New York, the legislature raised the property requirements so high just for black men so that they effectively closed down the option to blacks in New York as well. And, what was that like for a veteran? New Jersey was the first northern state to take back the right to vote. And there was, Thomas Carney, who enlisted for the duration. He survived Valley Forge. He fought at White Plains, Brandywine, Germantown, Monmouth, Camden, Guilford Courthouse, 96, Eutaw Springs. Now there's a man who gave everything but his life, and now he's told he's not worthy. And when Connecticut took away the right to vote from black men, there's Robin Starr, another of my vets, 6 years in the Continental line, a string of battles, wounded twice, a badge of merit winner, 2 badges of distinction winner, and now he's told he's not worthy. And there's one vet, I forget his name though, but in the same year that his state disenfranchised him, he got a letter from the Federal Pension Office saying that he was a hero of the Revolution. And as we turn the page onto the 19th century, there's what I call a frowning world for Black people. There's greater violence against Blacks. There's that ugly racist rhetoric about the innate inferiority of Blacks, starting with Thomas Jefferson and Notes on the State of Virginia. There are pseudoscientists, who are proving that Blacks are inferior because they measure the bumps on their head or they measure the angle of their skulls, and they proclaim these people as innately inferior. And I think that most white Americans in the 19th century would just as soon forget that African Americans contributed to the revolution. But the African American community is just not going to let that happen. The Black community confronts every outrage that's thrown at them after the war and uses not only the rhetoric of the war, but the example of the Black veterans, their sacrifice, their worthiness. So when white reformers dream up the idea of colonization, that is, freeing the slaves and then sending them far away, what seems like every Black church up north roars its disapproval. And in each case reminds the country of the blood spilled in the revolution by Black men. And when Pennsylvania moves to renege on Black voting rights, a group of Black Pennsylvanians, they produce this pamphlet, and they provide a veritable history lesson about the first Rhode Island. And the Black vets themselves, they protest the injustices. So the Black veteran stories, they continue into the early Republic. They confront a frowning world, but they are not lying down about it.
Many historians have argued that the American Revolution was a failure for African Americans. But in standing in their own light, you strongly disagree. So Judy, would you tell us why historians make that argument and how and why you disagree with it?
Well, those historians generally say that the revolution didn't live up to its rhetoric, and they'd be right about that. I wouldn't disagree with that. But to dismiss the revolution because it didn't free all the slaves and deliver on its promise of equality, I think that's wrong-headed. The revolution was a giant motor for change for African American life. Chapter 1 of this book deals with the vet's life before the revolution, when slavery was unquestioned for the most part. Thomas Jefferson said the institution was just part of the monotonous order of things. People didn't really think about it. It just was. And African American voices were few and far between in this period. After the war, that changes. Slavery would never again be an uncontested part of American life. Growing free Black communities loudly protested every one of the outrages that the white-dominated society threw at them. And at every turn, Black leaders and writers and speakers pointed to their fathers and their grandfathers in the Revolutionary War. So how do we get from 1783 to the 13th Amendment in the 1860s? Up until now, we've ignored the vets of 76. The African-American soldiers of the Revolution, they played a role. And they not only inspired the Black abolition movement, but they themselves, in the midst of an increasingly toxic racial environment, walked up those courthouse steps to get their pensions, and just as much to claim their due and proclaim their worthiness. Now, these events, of course, never make it to the front page of newspapers, but I believe that liberation often starts with small stories, and these vets of 76 all across the land, from 1818 to the mid-1840s, are reminding those in their communities that Black people belong in the country's founding story and are as deserving of a fair life as any white person.
Let's jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if John Lawrence had been successful in forming his Black regiment in South Carolina? How would the creation of such a unit have impacted the war and Southern society's ideas about African Americans?
Well, if he had been successful, that's a stretch to contemplate. But okay, so if he had been successful in forming a Black unit in South Carolina, I don't think much would have changed. It was slave labor, and what is produced by slave labor was just too profitable to imagine that the example of a Black regiment in South Carolina would change anybody's minds, or just about anybody's mind, about slavery. So I don't think that much would have changed. It behooved Southerners to think that African Americans were innately inferior, that they were children, and so on and so forth. So I don't think one unit of fighting men would have changed that. Cotton is cotton, and that's money. I just don't think it would have happened. I wish I could imagine a sunnier scenario for your question, but I really can't.
Judy, you've written 2 books about the American Revolution. Are you working on a third?
I'm working on an article with Amy Scott, one of my colleagues up at SUNY Cortland, and we found this African-American guy way up in Philadelphia County, in what's Montgomery County outside Philadelphia, who's extraordinary. And there I will stop because it's an incredible story about the way that he liberates himself and his 9 children out of slavery. So we're working on that. And I have a couple of more ideas in mind. But eventually, Liz, I'm going to be writing a book on the glam girls of the 1930s silver screen, because I'm an actor myself. And these women are workers in a new industry and they're feisty. And there's more to them than just the fancy clothes they wear and the movies that they make. So that's all in my future, hopefully.
And where should we look for more information about how we can contact you if we have any questions about the African-American soldiers of 76?
That's easy. That would be the SUNY Cortland website. You can reach me through the university. I'm currently on phased retirement, so I'm down here in Philadelphia, but I answer emails, so that would be the way to contact me.
Judith Van Buskirk, thank you for joining us from Ben Franklin's Philadelphia and for helping us explore the African-American military experience during the American Revolution.
You're quite welcome, Liz. This was fun. I hope I hear from some of your listeners.
The Continental Army was an integrated army. Long before President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, there had been a tradition of white and black Americans fighting alongside each other in battle. In fact, during the American War for Independence, the American Army had only one segregated regiment, and that was the white-officered all-black 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which served with distinction at the Battle of Newport in August 1778. Now, unlike white men, black men had to fight their way into the American Army. As Judy revealed, initially, the Continental Congress didn't want black men fighting in its army. Neither did George Washington. It was only when it became very apparent that black men actually had options, meaning that they could go serve in the British Army, did Congress and Washington relent and allow the minimal recruitment of black men. Once in the Army, black men served in all aspects of it. They fought in battle, constructed roads and fortifications, and helped keep the Army supplied by driving wagons. Still, it's hard to get at exactly what military life was like for black soldiers. As Judy noted, most of what we know about rank-and-file Revolutionary War soldiers, especially black soldiers, comes from the pension records. And blacks had to be very careful with submitting their pension applications because they relied on white civil servants to approve them. Therefore, most of the pension records we have are very terse. Plus, sometimes the records we have aren't very accurate. Remember, Congress passed the first Pension Act in 1818, 35 years after the war had ended. But what we do know is that black men joined the Continental Army for many of the same reasons white men did. They yearned for adventure, believed in the cause, and needed money. They also joined because they hoped for a better future. As Judy pointed out, black men knew they were fighting for a society with slavery, but they hoped that their service would change the status quo. And it did to a limited extent. After the Revolution, many began to question the institution of slavery, and some states began to dismantle it. Plus, black and abolitionist communities also used the example of black veterans to challenge limited access to rights and equality. As Judy noted, the American Revolution didn't live up to its rhetoric, but it still proved to be a motor of change for African Americans. Look for information about Judy, her book, Standing in Their Own Light, plus notes for what we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/157. If you enjoyed this episode, why not extend your journey by exploring the new American Revolution-themed joint issue of the William and Mary Quarterly? The Omohundro Institute is offering you a special listeners-only discounted rate for this issue of just $10. So get your copy by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/WMQ promo. And thank you, Omohundro Institute, for making today's episode possible. Finally, what do you think about the argument that some historians make that the American Revolution failed African Americans? Do you think it failed them? I'd love to know why or why not. So send your thoughts to me, Liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.